The fire had already swallowed half the dining room when my father reached the front door. "Dad." I shoved hard against the wheels of my chair, but the front caster caught in the rug that had buckled beneath the table. "Please don't leave me." My mother turned. For 1 second, I thought she was coming back. Then she looked at my wheelchair and grabbed my father's arm. "Leave her," she screamed. "Let her die in there. If Natalie's gone, Sabrina gets everything." My father looked straight at me. Not past me. Not through the smoke. At me. Then he pulled the door shut. The latch clicked. For 6 years, I had imagined there were limits to what my parents would do for my younger sister. That sound told me I had been wrong. Smoke rolled across the ceiling in thick black layers. Something cracked behind me, followed by the crash of glass. I tried the wheels again. Nothing. The rug had twisted under the caster, and a dining chair had fallen partly across my path. I could smell scorched wood, melted plastic, something chemical coming from the far side of the room. My lungs tightened. I stopped screaming. Not because I had accepted that I was going to die. Because screaming was using air I needed. 8 months earlier, my physical therapist, Lena, had stood in front of me between two parallel bars and said, "Your legs don't need to carry you across a room today. They need to remember what weight feels like." The first time, I had lasted 9 seconds. The week before the fire, I had made 43. My parents didn't know. They had stopped asking about rehab years ago. To them, the wheelchair was permanent evidence that I had lost. I locked the brakes. Both palms went flat on the edge of the dining table. My arms shook before I even pushed. "Come on," I whispered. My right leg took weight first. Then the left. Pain shot through my hips and lower back, sharp enough to make my vision flash white. My knees folded. I dropped back into the chair. A strip of burning curtain fell onto the floor behind me. I tried again. This time I leaned farther over the table before I pushed. My legs trembled violently. But they held. I stood. Not gracefully. Not triumphantly. I stood like someone balancing on borrowed bones. The side door was maybe 12 feet away. 12 feet might as well have been a mile. I slid one hand along the table, moved my right foot, then my left. My legs barely lifted. My brace caught against my pants. Every instinct in my body screamed for the wheelchair. One step, another. At the end of the table, there was nothing to hold. I grabbed the back of a chair, dragged it with me. By the time I reached the wall beside the side door, I was coughing so hard my ribs hurt. My fingers missed the handle twice. The third time, I got it. Cold night air hit my face. I half walked, half fell through the doorway, and landed hard on the patio stones. I remember lying there and hearing sirens somewhere beyond the trees. I remember my mother shouting my name from the front lawn. And I remember thinking something that frightened me more than the fire. She sounded relieved. I woke in the hospital with oxygen under my nose and a nurse adjusting the monitor beside me. My throat felt scraped raw. My legs felt worse. The first thing I asked was whether I had damaged my spinal cord further. The doctor told me nothing obvious suggested a new catastrophic injury, but I had overexerted muscles that were already compensating for years of weakness. They wanted imaging, observation, rest. Rest. I almost laughed. My phone had 27 notifications. 4 were from my mother, 3 from my father, 2 from Sabrina, 11 were from people at Carter Millworks, 5 were from Maya Brooks, our director of finance and controls. Before I could open anything, there was a knock. My mother walked in first. Dad followed. Mom looked as though she had aged 10 years overnight. Her hair was tied badly at the back of her neck, and there was soot along the sleeve of the sweater she had worn to the hospital. She hurried toward the bed. "Natalie." I raised one hand. "Don't." She stopped. Dad shut the door behind him. That sound made every muscle in my shoulders lock. He noticed. Of course he noticed. My father noticed anything that might affect leverage. "What happened last night was horrible," he said. I waited. Mom pressed both hands to her chest. We all panicked. "You looked at me, Natalie. I asked you not to leave me." Dad's jaw tightened. There was smoke everywhere. Your mother was terrified. I was trying to get everyone out. "You shut the door. I didn't know you were still that far behind us." I stared at him. For most of my life, My father had been able to make me question the obvious simply by lowering his voice. Not that morning. I was 12 feet away. His eyes moved toward the window. Mom stepped closer. You had smoke exposure. You were terrified. You may not remember every second exactly. There it was. Not an apology. An edit. I had spent my career reviewing manufacturing schedules, vendor contracts, cost forecasts, audit notes, production failures. I knew what people did when facts were inconvenient. They didn't always erase them. Sometimes they changed the frame around them. I remember what you said, I told her. Her face changed. Only slightly. But I saw it. Dad spoke before she could. This is not the time. No, it's exactly the time. Mom's voice trembled. We almost died too. For years, that sentence would have worked. It contained one of my family's favorite tricks. Turn what happened to me into something I was doing to them. I reached for the call button. My mother stared at my hand. What are you doing? I need to rest. We're your parents. I know. The nurse came in less than a minute later. I looked at her and said, I don't want visitors for a while. My mother went completely still. Dad gave me the expression he usually reserved for suppliers who had refused his terms. Natalie. I looked away. For once, I didn't explain. They left. The door stayed open behind them. That mattered more than it should have. A fire investigator spoke to me later that afternoon. He asked where everyone had been seated when I first noticed the fire, which exit my parents used, what I heard them say, how I got outside. I answered only what I knew. I didn't tell him what caused the fire. I didn't know. I didn't tell him my parents had planned to kill me. I couldn't prove that. But when he asked whether anyone had said anything unusual before the fire, one sentence came back with uncomfortable clarity. After dinner, Dad had poured himself another drink and said, almost casually, after tonight, Sabrina won't have to wait anymore. At the time, I had assumed he meant the succession discussion he had promised us. Now, I wasn't sure what anything meant. The investigator wrote it down without reacting. That helped. I was beginning to understand how valuable people were when they didn't tell me what to think. My phone rang 10 minutes after he left. Maya. I answered. Natalie. I'm here. Oh, thank God. Maya was not dramatic. In 12 years of working together, I had heard her swear exactly twice. Once when a bank froze a payroll transfer by mistake, and once when a forklift went through a warehouse door. So the strain in her voice got my attention. What happened? Are you okay first? Smoke inhalation. Overdid my legs. I'll live. A pause. Your legs? Long story. Okay. She understood when not to push. Then she said, did you authorize expanded executive authority for Sabrina? I sat straighter. What? There's a board consent packet circulating. Temporary authority expansion. Vendor commitments, brand spending, limited treasury approval, some personnel authority. I didn't authorize anything. I figured. Who sent it? Executive office. Dad. I pulled my laptop closer. My hands were suddenly colder than the room. Send me exactly what you received. It's already in your company email. I opened it. The first page used language I had seen 100 times. Continuity. Leadership stability. Temporary accommodation during recovery. My recovery. I kept reading. Sabrina Carter, EVP Brand and Growth, would receive expanded authority, while President and COO Natalie Carter remains medically unavailable. I was in a hospital bed less than 24 hours after my parents had left me inside a burning house, and my younger sister was already being positioned to receive pieces of my job. I scrolled to the footer. Bedeset finaldos. I stared at it. Maya. I'm here. What version did we review on Tuesday? 14. I thought so. I had worked from that document myself, and because I had spent 20 years in a company where the word final meant almost nothing, I had a habit my sister loved to mock. I kept working copies. Not secret files. Not stolen documents. The files sent to me for meetings, budgets, vendor reviews, forecasts, the documents I was expected to use to do my job. My Tuesday board packet was still attached to an email in a folder labeled Current Board. Version 14. I opened it beside version 17. 3 new sections. 2 edits to succession language. 1 new note about Sabrina. My pulse climbed. Maya, don't delete anything. I wasn't planning to. Don't send me anything I don't already have access to. Don't make copies outside normal retention. Don't touch the history. I understand. If someone asks you to clean up drafts, I follow policy. That was why I had hired her. Not because she was loyal to me. Because she was loyal to systems when people became inconvenient. Thank you. Natalie? Yes? There's something else. I closed my eyes. Of course there is. The board vote is scheduled for tomorrow morning. 6 years earlier, I had been 34, and walking into the future, my father had spent a decade telling me I was earning. I had worked in nearly every part of Carter Millworks: purchasing, scheduling, floor operations, vendor management, client recovery, margins. When Dad wanted a problem fixed, he called me. When he wanted photographs for the trade magazine, he called Sabrina. She was 6 years younger, charming, beautiful, quick with names and faces. Sabrina could remember a client's wife's favorite wine after one dinner. She just couldn't tell you why a delayed hardware shipment in Indiana would put 3 hospital renovation projects behind schedule 2 weeks later. A month before my accident, one of our independent directors had congratulated me after a board meeting. Looks like Robert's finally ready to make it official. President first, CEO eventually. That had been the plan. Then came the accident. One day, I was walking a plant floor. The next, I was learning how to transfer from a hospital bed into a wheelchair without falling. 3 weeks later, Sabrina appeared in a company announcement as acting executive vice president. Dad sat beside me in rehab when I saw it. "You focus on getting better," he said. "Sabrina can be the face for now." For now, that phrase lasted 6 years. Within months, production schedules were slipping. Vendor penalties climbed. 2 major clients threatened to leave. I began working from rehab. Then from home. Eventually from my office. Wheelchair and all. The company stabilized. Sabrina kept the title. I kept the problems. And somehow, I had still spent 6 years believing my father would eventually look around and say the obvious thing. "Natalie, we couldn't have done this without you." He never did. Maya drove me home the next afternoon. I could have hired someone. I could have asked one of a dozen employees. But Maya was already leaving the hospital after bringing my work bag, and she offered once. I accepted once. That was another thing I was trying to learn. Help was not the same thing as surrender. My condo looked exactly as I had left it. Accessible kitchen, wide passages, low shelving, grab rails. Most of it had been chosen while I was still in rehab, with my mother standing beside contractors saying things like, "Natalie won't be able to manage that." I had been too tired to argue. For 6 years, I had called the place mine. Standing in the doorway after the fire, I realized how much of it still looked like a recovery room my family had designed around who they believed I had become. I set my bag down. Then I changed 3 things. My emergency contact, the access code my parents knew, and the note on my medical file authorizing my mother to receive scheduling information. None of those actions were dramatic. That was the point. My phone buzzed. "Mom." I almost ignored it. Then I read the message. "Your father is willing to forgive what you said at the hospital if you stop making this about Sabrina." I read it twice, then placed the phone face down. Maya was standing near the kitchen. "What?" "Nothing I need to answer." Her eyebrows lifted. She had known me too long not to understand how unusual that sentence was. I opened my laptop. If my parents wanted Sabrina to have everything, I wanted to know what everything meant. The first thing I checked was the expense summary attached to tomorrow's board packet. Brand partnerships and executive development. The number made me pause. It had more than tripled in 18 months. I clicked into the category. Consulting. Client entertainment. Executive development. Brand strategy. One vendor appeared 4 times. Westbridge Creative Advisory. I didn't recognize it. That alone bothered me. I knew our major vendors. Not because I micromanaged every invoice. Because procurement was how I had built half the controls that kept Carter Millworks alive. I moved to approval notes. Sabrina. Sabrina. Executive override. Sabrina. Executive override. My fingers stopped. Some of those amounts exceeded her delegated authority. I opened the board packet again. Near the end was a sentence I had skimmed past in the hospital. S. C. Succession transition to proceed if N. C. remains unavailable. The phrasing scratched at something in my memory. Not the meaning, the structure. I searched my old email. Succession. Contingency. Incapacity. One file appeared from 6 years earlier. My stomach tightened before I opened it. Interim succession, contingency, effective upon Natalie Carter's incapacity. I remembered seeing the title after the accident. At the time, Dad had told me it had been prepared in response to the crisis. Responsible management. Nothing personal. I clicked File Properties. Then I stared at the creation date. For several seconds, I thought I had misread the year. I checked again. 3 days. The succession contingency that transferred operational authority towards Sabrina had been created 3 days before the accident that put me in a wheelchair. Maya must have seen something change in my face. What is it? I turned the screen toward her. She read the date. Neither of us spoke. My parents had left me inside a burning house because, in my mother's own words, Sabrina would get everything if I died. Until that moment, I had been trying to understand why they had wanted me gone now. Looking at that date, another question became much harder to avoid. What if this wasn't the first time they had needed me out of Sabrina's way? By Monday morning, the creation date on that succession file had stopped looking like a coincidence. It had not started looking like proof. That distinction mattered. 3 days before the accident that damaged my spinal cord, someone inside Carter Millworks had created a contingency plan that moved operational authority towards Sabrina if I became incapacitated. 6 years later, while I was still in a hospital bed after my parents left me inside a burning house, another document was already waiting to expand her authority again. Those facts belonged on the same page. What they meant was still an open question. I had learned the hard way that suspicion felt satisfying long before it became useful. Maya met me outside the executive entrance at 8:15. She glanced at my chair, then at the cane strapped along one side. You sure about this? No, that's not what I asked. It's the answer you're getting. Her mouth twitched. The building smelled exactly as it always did on Monday mornings. Coffee from reception, sawdust drifting in from the production side, printer toner, floor cleaner. That familiarity almost made everything worse. 6 years earlier, I had returned to this same building in a wheelchair and watched people pretend not to look at it. Now, they were pretending not to look at me because half the company had already heard about the fire. The elevator doors opened on the executive floor. Sabrina was standing near reception. She wore cream trousers, a fitted navy jacket, and the expression she used whenever she wanted concern to photograph well. Natalie. Her eyes moved over me. You shouldn't be here yet. I'm aware of where I am. I mean, after what happened. What happened is exactly why I'm here. 2 assistants nearby suddenly found their screens fascinating. Sabrina lowered her voice. Dad was trying to protect continuity. By scheduling a vote while I was in the hospital? You were medically unavailable. For less than a day. Her jaw tightened. It was temporary. So was your title 6 years ago. That landed. Not dramatically. Sabrina didn't gasp or flinch. She simply looked past me toward Maya, then back. We're not doing this in the hallway. Good. I rolled toward the conference room. Bring me the authority matrix, the last 3 board packets, and the current approval summary. Sabrina followed. You're doing exactly what Dad said you'd do. That made me stop. What did Dad say I'd do? Her face went blank too quickly. That you'd come in angry. I asked for documents. You're obsessed with signatures and thresholds when there are bigger problems. Signatures and thresholds are how bigger problems become visible. Her lips pressed together. Then she asked, why are you looking at 6-year-old files anyway? For a second, every sound around us seemed to separate. The hum of the lights. A phone ringing at reception. Someone laughing farther down the hall. I had never told Sabrina about the contingency file. Never told Mom. Never told Dad. Only Maya had seen the date on my screen. Sabrina realized something had changed in my face. What? Nothing. You're staring at me. I'm wondering why you think I'm looking at 6-year-old files. She folded her arms. Dad said you were digging through old records. There it was. Not an answer. A source. I turned toward the conference room. Then Dad and I have something to discuss later. Behind me, Sabrina said. You always do this. I kept moving. Do what? Turn everything into an investigation. The elevator doors closed before I answered. That was probably for the best, because the first thought in my head was that people only disliked investigations when the answers mattered. The expense dashboard was already open when Maya came into my office. I had not touched Sabrina's personal accounts. I had not gone searching for hidden bank transfers. Everything on my screen belonged to the business and sat inside systems I used every week as president and chief operating officer. Brand partnerships, client development, executive consulting. 3 categories that had grown fast enough to deserve questions even if Sabrina had been my favorite person on earth. Maya set a folder beside me. The approval matrix. I know. You designed it. Which is why I'm offended you printed it. That printer needs attention. I almost smiled. Almost. The first questionable invoice belonged to Westbridge Creative Advisory. Then another. Then a third. None was enormous by itself. That was important. People expected financial misconduct to arrive wearing a ski mask and carrying a bag with a $sign painted on it. Real problems usually wore better shoes. One invoice listed brand strategy consultation. Another listed executive positioning. A third covered client development support. Deliverables? I asked. Maya clicked through the linked files. A presentation. A summary memo. A list of recommendations vague enough to fit almost any company. Who owns Westbridge? I haven't checked beyond vendor onboarding. Don't. Maya looked over. Not yet. If I was going to question Sabrina's spending, I wanted to begin with what the records already showed, not with a hunt for something scandalous. The next column mattered more. Approval. Sabrina. Sabrina. Executive override. Sabrina. Executive override. My fingers stopped on the mouse. What was her individual limit when these were processed? Maya opened the matrix. The threshold had changed once during the last 2 years, but neither version allowed Sabrina to approve several of the larger commitments alone. These required a second authority, I said. Yes. Who? The dashboard only shows executive override at this level. Then we ask the system owner for the normal audit path when the review is authorized. Maya watched me for a moment. You're being very careful. I'm trying to be. You don't have to convince me. No. But I may have to convince people who already believe they know why I'm asking. That was the danger. If I called every bad expense theft, Sabrina could point to one legitimate invoice and call the whole thing revenge. If I called every omission fraud, Dad could dismiss me as emotional. So I created 4 columns. Unsupported. Conflict question. Above delegated threshold. Needs explanation. No adjectives. No conclusions. Just things that did not fit. By lunch, the pattern was worse. Not because there was one devastating transaction. Because there wasn't. There was repetition. A consulting firm appearing again and again. Client development costs without clear client names. Brand events booked through preferred vendors. Charges just low enough to avoid one level of review, followed by larger commitments that appeared under executive override. Small deviations become systems when nobody makes them stop. That was something I understood professionally. I was beginning to understand it personally, too. Before leaving the office for my next appointment, I opened a blank spreadsheet and named it Source Index. Maya leaned against the doorway. What's that? What I already have. Not what I could get. Not what someone might send me later. What had legitimately reached my hands during years of doing my job. Board packets emailed before meetings. Budget drafts sent for my review. Forecast attachments. Vendor reports. The incident documents from my insurance claim 6 years ago. My own meeting notes. Calendar invitations. The working copies, stored on my laptop because I had needed them for real decisions. Sabrina had mocked that habit for years. Nat keeps every version like somebody's going to put her spreadsheets in a museum. She thought it was fear of forgetting. It wasn't. Versions told you what people changed after they learned something new. At the time, I had never imagined I might need that lesson against my own father. I entered each file with the date I received it. Who sent it? Which version? what it appeared to establish, and a final column that mattered most, what it did not establish. The old succession contingency proved someone prepared for my incapacity before the accident. It did not prove who ordered the accident. The spending records showed controls had been bypassed or exceeded. They did not prove Sabrina stole every dollar. The altered incident report might prove a warning disappeared. It would not tell me why until I could identify who requested the change. Facts had edges. I wanted to keep them. That afternoon, I met Denise Harper in a coffee shop 20 minutes from the plant. She had been safety director when I was hurt. For 6 years, the sight of her name at the bottom of my incident report had been enough to make my stomach tighten. I blamed her because blame liked signatures. Denise arrived wearing a brown coat that looked too heavy for the weather. Gray had taken over most of her hair since I had last seen her. She stopped when she saw the wheelchair. Then her attention moved to my face. Natalie. Denise. She sat across from me but did not remove her coat. I almost didn't come. I assumed that. You always did say exactly what you meant. Only at work. Something like regret crossed her expression. I hated that I noticed. Coffee sat between us untouched. I want to know why the incident report changed, I said. Denise looked out the window. You saw more than one? I have the version attached to my original claim. The current archive copy isn't identical. Her eyes closed briefly. That was the first confirmation I got. And it was not enough. Did you write the first version? Yes. Did you write the final one? I signed it. That wasn't my question. Her hands tightened around the paper cup. No. The anger came so quickly I tasted metal. Who did? Parts were rewritten after review. By whom? I don't know every person who touched it. Who asked you to change it? Denise looked at me then. Really looked. There had been an unresolved safety concern. My hands went still. What kind? I'm not going to give you technical details. I can't document anymore. That answer irritated me. It also made me trust her slightly more. What can you document? The first draft referenced a hold recommendation. The final did not. Why? Senior management wanted the report focused on procedural failure at the site. Senior management meaning my father. She hesitated. That discussion included Robert. Included. Not ordered. Not confessed. Included. I wrote the word down. Denise noticed. You're taking notes. I'm not doing this twice. Her mouth tightened. Natalie, I signed the final report. I know. I should have refused. Yes. I had worked there almost 19 years. Robert offered me severance. I told myself the report still described an accident, just not every argument that came before it. You told yourself? That I wasn't changing the outcome. The laugh that escaped me had no humor in it. The outcome was that I stopped walking. I know. Do you? She did not defend herself. That was more uncomfortable than an excuse would have been. After a moment, Denise said, the version you saw was not the version I first wrote. Outside, a delivery truck hissed to a stop near the curb. For years, I had made Denise the villain in that memory, because her signature gave the story a clean ending. Now the ending had moved. What happened to the first draft? I don't have it. Did it ever exist outside the company system? I sent supporting emails when I asked for the inspection delay. To whom? She stared at her coffee. I need to look. Why should I believe you'll do that now? You shouldn't. That answer sat between us. Then Denise said, but I'm tired of knowing I chose my job over the truth. I put my notebook away. Looking doesn't fix what you did. I know. Good. On the drive to rehab, anger kept trying to become certainty. Dad knew. Dad planned it. Dad wanted me injured. Each thought came with the emotional satisfaction of a locked door. My job was not to walk through it without evidence. At the clinic, Lena positioned my chair between the parallel bars. Today we go easy. I hate those words. You inhaled smoke and dragged yourself through a burning room. I've had worse weeks. No, you've had different bad weeks. She checked my brace. Ready? Both hands closed around the bars. Standing hurt more than it had before the fire. My legs shook almost immediately. 10 seconds. Maybe 12. Then I sat. Frustration rose so fast I almost snapped at her. Instead, I looked down at my hands. Years earlier, before the accident, Dad had stood in my office and told me Sabrina needed a chance to be more than my little sister. Back then, I heard guilt. Maybe I was supposed to step aside. Share attention. Let her grow. Now the same sentence sounded different. But memory was not evidence. Again, I said. Lena raised an eyebrow. You sure? Yes. This time I lasted a little longer. Afterward, while she adjusted the strap on my brace, I said, I want to change my goals. How? Stop writing them around what my parents think is realistic. Lena's hands paused. Then she handed me the clipboard. Your plan. Exactly. My plan. By the time I returned to Carter Millworks, Maya had found the old insurance archive path I was entitled to review. The final incident report sat where it always had. I opened the PDF from my original claim beside it. Same incident. Same date. Same signature. Different language. The earlier copy included a reference to an unresolved inspection issue. The archive version did not. The archive copy had also been modified after the date of my accident. Maya looked at the file properties. That proves the document changed. Not who changed it. Correct. Not why. Correct. Good. She glanced at me. You're happy about that? I'm happy we know what we know. Before we could go farther, my assistant appeared in the doorway. Your father wants you in the main conference room. Who's there? Robert, Diane, Sabrina. Of course. The room looked exactly as it had during hundreds of budget meetings. Same walnut table. Same water glasses. Same photograph of my grandfather opening the first Carter workshop. Dad did not ask me to sit. That would have been ridiculous. Natalie, he began, this needs to stop. What does? Digging through old files. Interrogating Sabrina. Contacting former employees. Mom leaned forward. You've been through something terrible. Nobody blames you for being upset. There it was again. The soft version. Turn evidence into emotion. Turn questions into symptoms. Sabrina folded her hands. You're treating every mistake like a conspiracy. I placed my notebook on the table. I have 3 questions. Dad exhaled through his nose. I'm not participating in an interrogation. Then call it a board preparation conversation. His eyes narrowed. First, why was a succession contingency prepared 3 days before my accident? Nobody answered. Second, who requested changes to my incident report after I was injured? Mom looked at Dad. Sabrina looked at the window. Third, who authorized expenses above Sabrina's delegated approval threshold? Dad pushed back from the table. That's enough. No, those are the questions. You have no idea how many decisions had to be made while you were recovering. I know exactly how many. I spent 6 years fixing them. Mom's voice sharpened. We took care of you. There it was. The invoice. You helped me after I was hurt. That doesn't give you ownership of what happened. Sabrina stood. This is insane. Dad raised one hand. Then he looked at me. Effective immediately. Access to historical executive archives is restricted pending council review. The sentence should have frightened me. Instead, something settled. He thought the archive was the memory. It wasn't. Not all of it. I had 6 years of board packets in my email. Working copies. Claim files. My own notes. The documents I had been sent because the company required me to make decisions from them. Closing the archive did not close the past. I reached for my phone. Dad's gaze dropped to it. What are you doing? Putting this in writing. Natalie. A month earlier, that tone still might have stopped me. I opened an email. To the corporate secretary. Maya. The independent directors. Subject. Record preservation and governance conflict. My thumb hovered over send. Mom whispered, Don't do this to us. For once, I understood the sentence exactly. She wasn't asking me not to hurt them. She was asking me to keep absorbing the consequences. I pressed send. The email left my phone. Something had changed. Not in the room. In me. I was done asking permission to keep records of what people did. Denise's message arrived that night. No greeting. No apology. Just one sentence. I found the email that made me stop fighting. An attachment sat beneath it. The chain began with a recommendation to hold the inspection until an unresolved issue was corrected. Several replies followed. Then, the final message. From my father. I read it once. Then again. Natalie is already on her way. We are not delaying this again. For 6 years, I had believed my accident began when something went wrong at the plant. Now I had proof that, before I arrived, someone had warned my father not to let the inspection proceed. And he had sent me in anyway. For most of that night, my father's email sat open on my laptop like a blade laid flat on a table. Natalie is already on her way. We are not delaying this again. There were at least 6 ways to read that sentence. Only one of them let me sleep, so I stopped trying. By sunrise, the dining table in my condo had disappeared beneath paper. Not because I had printed everything I could find. The opposite. 4 sheets, 4 columns. Succession, safety, money, narrative. The first column began 3 days before my accident, when the contingency plan naming Sabrina had been created. The second began with Denise's hold recommendation and Dad's refusal to delay. The third covered the last 18 months of brand spending, consulting invoices, executive overrides, and vendor commitments. The fourth contained the phrases my parents used whenever facts became inconvenient. You were recovering. Sabrina was only helping. We had to protect continuity. You're too upset to remember clearly. The more I looked at the columns, the less they resembled separate problems. That frightened me. It also steadied me. 6 years earlier, Sabrina had been given authority because I was temporarily unavailable. Last month, I had tightened approval controls after noticing brand spending rising faster than revenue. Then came the dinner at the lake house. Then the fire. Then, before I was even discharged, another authority expansion appeared with my medical condition written into its justification. A pattern was not proof of intent, but it was enough to ask better questions. Maya arrived just after 8 with coffee and a look at the dining table that made her stop in the doorway. You alphabetized the disaster. Chronological. Of course. She set 1 cup beside my laptop. Her eyes moved across the 4 columns. What are you trying to prove? Nothing yet. That's not very Natalie of you. It needs to become very Natalie of me. That got her attention. I pointed to the spending column. We separate what Sabrina could approve from what she couldn't. No shortcuts. No calling everything theft because it makes the story cleaner. And the safety side? Same rule. Maya nodded slowly. What about the fire? That belongs to the investigators. Her eyebrows lifted. You're keeping it separate? I'm keeping the evidence separate. That distinction mattered more every day. The fire made everything emotionally louder. It did not give me permission to become sloppy. By mid-morning, Sabrina agreed to meet me in my office. She entered without knocking, wearing the same confidence she had carried into board presentations since the year I was hurt. Dad says you're trying to freeze my authority. I'm trying to understand how much authority you actually have. You know exactly what I have. That's what I thought. She remained standing. I turned the monitor slightly so she could see the expense categories. Westbridge Creative Advisory. Her expression barely changed. What about them? 3 strategy contracts, 2 executive positioning retainers, 1 client development extension. So I want to know what they delivered. They're a brand consultancy. That isn't an answer. A muscle moved in her jaw. Maybe because you never respected what I do. This is not about whether I respect branding. It always is. Then make it simple for me. Show me the deliverables. She folded her arms. Ask procurement. I did. And? They have what was uploaded. I'm asking what you approved. Her eyes moved to the spreadsheet. This is ridiculous. Some of these payments are within your limit. Some aren't. Dad approved my growth plan. There it was. Not the answer I expected. Dad approved the plan? Yes. Or the individual payments. Her gaze shifted. He gave me authority. How much? You know how Dad works. I know exactly how the matrix works. She gave a short laugh. That stupid matrix again. The one you called my little cage? I said you like making people ask permission. No. I like making people explain where the money goes. The room went still. Then I slid another page toward her. Did you know there was a succession contingency prepared before my accident? Her fingers stopped against her sleeve. That was enough to tell me the question was not entirely new. How much did you know? Natalie, how much? Sabrina looked toward the door, then back at me. I knew Dad had a plan. Before the accident? I knew they'd been talking about what happened if you couldn't come back. The words hit harder than I expected. Couldn't come back from what? She frowned. Work, recovery, whatever. The document was created before I got hurt. I didn't create it. That isn't what I asked. Sabrina's voice sharpened. You're trying to make me responsible for something that happened 6 years ago? I'm asking whether you knew my position was going to become yours if I couldn't work. Her face changed then. Not guilt. Defensiveness. You were in a wheelchair, Nat. How long were we supposed to wait? For a second, every prepared question disappeared. The office seemed smaller. 6 years of physical therapy, pain, transfers, hospital beds, modified desks, exhausted nights reviewing production schedules from my condo. All of it collapsed into one sentence. How long were we supposed to wait? Not for me to recover. For me to get out of the way. Sabrina must have seen something in my face because her tone shifted. That's not what I meant. Yes, it is. No. I mean the company needed someone visible. You mean someone standing. I mean someone who could travel. Go to events. Be in rooms. I was in rooms. Not the same rooms. That was the first honest thing she had said. I let the silence sit. Then I asked, which of the larger payments did Dad personally approve? Her mouth opened. Closed. The pause lasted less than 3 seconds. It was enough. Ask him, she said. I will. She left before I could ask anything else. I watched the door close. For the first time, Sabrina looked less like the person who had built the machine and more like someone who had learned how comfortable it was to sit inside it. That did not make her innocent. It only changed where I needed to look next. Maya and I spent the afternoon rebuilding the approval history from records we already had. The work was almost boring. That was why it mattered. Real systems rarely collapsed because someone discovered a secret vault. They collapsed because ordinary records stopped agreeing with each other. The first group of expenses fell squarely within Sabrina's authority. Her signature, her project, her responsibility. The second group had missing support. The third raised conflict questions because of vendor relationships that had not been fully disclosed in the files we had. The fourth group mattered most. Above threshold. Executive override required. More than one of them. Maya tapped the screen. If these were processed correctly, someone above her had to approve them. Or someone changed the authority structure. Do we have any board approval for that? Not in the versions I received. She leaned back. So either there's documentation we haven't seen, or the authority wasn't what they're claiming now. Neither possibility was small. I added another line to the timeline. Not proof. Question. That was enough. Around 6, Maya was still in my office when I closed the spreadsheet. She looked at me as if I had done something medically concerning. What? You closed it. It's 6 o'clock. You never close anything at 6 o'clock. That's going to change. Because of the fire? Because I nearly died in a house while my mother argued that Sabrina should get everything. Maya stared at me. I had not told her the exact words before. The sentence sounded uglier outside my own head. Go home, I said. What about tomorrow's call? It will still exist tomorrow. And if Robert moves it, then he moves it. Her expression softened, which irritated me enough to add, don't make that face. What face? The one where you think I'm having a breakthrough. I was thinking you finally discovered evenings. Get out. She laughed and left. For several minutes, I remained behind my desk. Then I did something that felt more difficult than sending the preservation email. I went home. The condo was exactly as I had left it that morning. Laptop charger on the kitchen counter. Printed records covering half the table. Resistance bands beside the chair. A box of corporate files near the window. 6 years after my accident, nearly every room still carried evidence of one of two identities. Patient. Executive. There was almost nothing that belonged to Natalie without a role attached. I began with the dining table. Every document went into a locking cabinet in the spare room. Not destroyed. Not hidden. Put away. The table underneath was pale oak. I had forgotten that. Mom chose it after my accident because the legs left enough clearance for my chair. At the time, I had been grateful. That gratitude had somehow turned into a requirement to keep every decision she made. I ordered dinner from the Thai place I used to love before rehab turned meals into logistics. Then I texted Maya. No calls after 8 unless payroll, safety, or production is actually at risk. 3 dots appeared. Then, who are you, and what have you done with Natalie? I smiled, despite myself. A second message followed. Understood. The next morning, Lena handed me the parallel bars. Easy day. I'm beginning to think that's a threat. Stand first. Complain second. My legs trembled almost immediately. The fire had set me back. Not dramatically. Enough. After 20 seconds, I lowered myself into the chair. Again? Lena asked. Not yet. That surprised both of us. For years, I had treated pain like proof I was serious. At work, at rehab, at home. Maybe that was why everyone around me had become so comfortable asking for more. Write something down for me, I said. Lena grabbed the clipboard. What? My rehab goals. You already have goals. Not those. She waited. I want to be able to stand long enough to cook at my own counter, transfer safely when I'm tired, walk short distances because I want the option, not because my parents need proof I'm recovering. Lena handed me the clipboard instead. Your plan. 2 words. My plan. I wrote them myself. By the time I reached the executive conference room that afternoon, Dad was already there. Mom sat beside him. 2 independent directors joined by video, Ellen Price and Thomas Greer. Both had served long enough to remember the company before Sabrina's title existed. That mattered. They also remembered what happened after my accident. Revenue did not collapse, but margins did. On-time delivery slipped. Emergency borrowing increased. 2 key clients threatened to rebid major contracts. 6 months after I began working again, those numbers reversed. Not because I was heroic, because operations had been my job before I got hurt, and I knew how to do it afterward too. Dad opened the call. We need to separate governance from emotion. For once, I agreed. So I let him talk. He described the fire, my recovery, my renewed concerns about Sabrina. Then he said, Natalie has been reviewing historical materials under significant personal stress, and I believe we need to be careful not to turn a private conflict into a corporate purge. Ellen looked toward my image on her screen. Natalie, I did not talk about Mom leaving me in the fire. Did not mention Sabrina's comment about waiting for me. Did not mention Dad's email from 6 years earlier. Not yet. Instead, I shared 3 charts: on-time delivery, gross margin, emergency credit utilization. These are the 6 years since I returned after my accident, I said. The issue I'm raising is not whether anyone likes me or Sabrina more. Dad shifted in his chair. The issue is whether delegated authority matches the controls the board approved, whether transactions above threshold received proper authorization, and whether the records currently being used to justify expanded authority are reliable. Thomas leaned closer to his camera. How much exposure? I don't know yet. Dad scoffed quietly. I continued. That's why I'm asking for a targeted review, not making an accusation. Ellen asked, and the historical files? One incident report related to my accident exists in versions that do not match. A succession contingency naming Sabrina was created before that accident. Those facts are relevant to whether current succession records should be accepted without review. Dad cut in. This is exactly what I mean. Thomas looked at him. Robert, if board records don't match, that's not personal. The room changed, only slightly. But enough. Ellen asked me what I wanted. Preserve the records. Do not expand Sabrina's authority until the spending questions are reviewed. Limit the review to specified transactions and related approvals. And operations? Thomas asked. Continue normally. Dad leaned back. You're creating instability. No. I'm asking the board to find out whether the instability already exists. Neither independent director declared me right. That would have been unrealistic. They did something more important. They agreed the question belonged to governance. The vote on Sabrina's expanded authority was postponed pending review. It was the first concrete thing my father had lost. Not because anyone felt sorry for me. Because the company could not afford to pretend controls did not matter. Denise called that evening. I found something else. Her voice sounded thinner than before. What? Context. That's a dangerous word. I know. We met again the next morning. This time she brought no dramatic envelope. Just a small stack of printed emails and notes she had retained from her own employment records. The safety team recommended a delay, she said. I have that email. This is what happened after. She pointed to a chain. Denise had written that inspection should not proceed until the unresolved condition was corrected. A plant manager asked whether the executive visit could be rescheduled. Dad's response came later. Natalie is already on her way. We are not delaying this again. Then another email after my accident. Dad again. The incident summary should focus on site procedure and immediate operational failure. Speculation regarding executive scheduling decisions is not useful. I read it twice. Did he order you to remove the warning? He told us to keep the report focused. That isn't the same thing. No. Did he know I would be injured? I don't know. Did he know the inspection had not been cleared? Denise looked at the emails. He knew we had asked for a delay. That was what she could say. Nothing more. 6 years of anger pressed against my ribs. But beneath it was something worse. Recognition. A succession plan had been prepared. A delay had been requested. Dad knew. He sent me anyway. Afterward, the record changed. Sabrina stepped into the opening. None of that proved he had planned the accident. It did prove the old story, an unforeseeable chain of site mistakes followed by emergency succession, was no longer believable to me. The person at the center was not Sabrina. It had always been Dad. By late afternoon, he asked me to come to his office. Mom was there. No, Sabrina. Dad gestured toward the chair across from his desk. I stayed in my wheelchair. He folded his hands. This has gone far enough. I agree. His eyes sharpened. Good. I think we mean different things. Mom hid. Natalie, please. Dad opened a folder. For the first time in my life, he did not begin by telling me what Sabrina needed. He said, "You are the only one who can actually run this company." The sentence I had wanted for years arrived so quietly that I almost missed what it did to me. No applause. No boardroom. No public acknowledgement. Just Dad, finally admitting the thing everyone else had already known. A younger version of me would have given almost anything for those words. Maybe that was why he chose them. He pushed a document toward me. CEO. I stared at him. Effective, after board approval. Sabrina's authority would be reduced. You choose your operating structure. Finance reports directly to you. Mom leaned forward. Your father is trying to fix this. For one dangerous second, I saw the future I had imagined at 34. My name on the office. Real authority. No more pretending Sabrina and I contributed the same thing in different ways. No more asking permission to fix problems I would be blamed for anyway. Then I turned the page. Settlement. Historical family and management disputes resolved. Internal review concluded. No further inquiry necessary. Accident-related governance questions considered closed. Public language regarding the fire to be coordinated as a tragic family emergency. My fingers stopped at the bottom. Mom watched me. Isn't this what you always wanted? Yes. That was the problem. Dad had finally found the price he thought I would accept. Not money. Not love. Recognition. The chair. I looked at him. If I sign this, the spending review stops? We resolve it internally. And the old incident records? We stop tearing open the past. The fire? We stop damaging each other. There was almost elegance in the way he said it. No confession. No threat. Just a deal in which I received everything I had spent half my life earning, provided I agreed never to ask what it had cost me. Can I keep this copy? Dad hesitated. It's a draft. So that's a yes? He slid it fully across the desk. Think carefully. I did. Not for long. Back at my condo, the document sat on the dining table. The table I had cleared. The table I had reclaimed less than 2 days earlier. For once, there were no other files around it. Just the offer. CEO. Authority. Recognition. Silence. A pen lay beside my hand. My father had finally chosen me. All I had to do was help him bury the reason he had waited so long. I uncapped the pen. At the top of the first page, Above the title of the agreement, I wrote one word: rejected. The word rejected looked almost too small for what it cost me. One word, one chair, one lifetime of waiting for my father to admit I was the daughter who had actually kept his company alive. By 7 the next morning, the marked agreement had been scanned, attached to an email, and sent back to him. No speech, no explanation, just one sentence. I will not accept authority in exchange for closing legitimate review of company records or coordinating a version of events I do not believe is accurate. His reply came 9 minutes later. Then, do not expect me to protect your position. For years, that sentence would have terrified me. Protection from Dad had never really meant safety. It meant continued access, continued belonging, continued permission to occupy whatever space he had decided I deserved. This time, I typed 4 words. I am not asking you to. Before I could send them, Mom called. The phone vibrated across my kitchen table, while steam rose from coffee I had forgotten to drink. I let it ring. She called again. Then a third time. Finally, a text appeared. Please don't turn this into something none of us can undo. I stared at the message. There was no mention of leaving me in the fire. No mention of the spending. No mention of the report that had changed after my accident. The irreversible thing, apparently, was me refusing to make all of it disappear. I sent Dad my reply. Then I sent a second message to both of them. From now on, company matters stay in company channels. I will not attend private meetings at the house. Sabrina will not be used to relay messages between us. Mom answered immediately. So now we need rules to speak to our own daughter? The old reflex rose in me. Explain. Soften. Make her understand. Instead, I placed the phone face down and finished my coffee. At 9:12, my company login stopped working. Not entirely. Email still opened. Operational dashboards still loaded. Production reports, vendor schedules, payroll projections, everything I needed to keep the company running remained available. Historical executive archives did not. Neither did several administrative folders tied to board governance. A notification waited in my inbox. Pending review of potential conflicts relating to current internal inquiries. Historical executive archive access has been temporarily restricted. Signed by the executive chairman. Dad. Maya appeared in my doorway 10 minutes later. You got the notice? Apparently, I'm dangerous to old PDFs. This isn't funny. No, but I'm trying something new where I don't panic every time he moves a piece. She closed the door. What do you need? Nothing you're not authorized to give me. Her expression tightened. I know that. I need you to hear me say it. Maya pulled out the chair across from my desk. Okay. No backdoors. No screenshots from restricted systems. No favor because you think I deserve one. You think Robert is going to accuse us of tampering? I think he'll accuse us of whatever becomes useful. That silenced the room. My laptop still contained what it had contained the day before. Board packets sent directly to me. Working copies used for meetings. Email attachments. My insurance claim documents. Denise's emails. My own notes and calendars. Dad could close a library. He could not make me unread books I had already been handed. A blank document went onto the screen. Source. Date received. Is version. What it showed. What it did not show. Maya watched the columns appear. You've done this before. Not for this. You know what I mean. I did. For years, my job had been separating what people believed from what production records could actually support. A shipment was not late because someone had a bad week. It was late because material arrived on Thursday, machining began Friday, finishing missed Monday, and delivery moved 3 days. Systems left footprints. So did people. By noon, every document I intended to rely on had a source and a date attached to it. Nothing appeared by magic. Nothing required Maya to break policy. Nothing required me to become someone my father could dismiss as reckless. At 12:30, my phone rang from a number I had already saved. The fire investigator. He asked whether I could come in the next morning to clarify parts of my statement. Yes. There are a few timing questions. About what? I'd rather go through them with you in person. That was all he told me. No dramatic announcement. No promise that someone was about to be arrested. Just questions. After we hung up, A second thought arrived. Dad had been operating as though the fire existed in one box, and the company in another. So, had I. The difference was that I was trying to preserve those boundaries. He might not have the same luxury much longer. At 5:45, Maya found me shutting down my computer. She checked the clock. "You have the independent review prep tomorrow." "I know." "And the investigator." "I know." "You're leaving." "Rehab." "Natalie, I can bring the transaction files to your condo." "No." She stared. "No?" "No." A year earlier, I would have canceled physical therapy without thinking. Then spent the evening convincing myself that sacrificing my body for the company proved how necessary I was. Dad had trained me well. Not with orders. With praise. "You're the reliable one. You understand what's at stake. Sabrina can't handle this. Natalie will fix it." Every compliment came with an invoice. I picked up my bag. "If the building catches fire, call me." Maya gave me a look. Bad choice of words. Fair. Then I left. My legs were worse that evening. Lena did not need to tell me. The first stand lasted 16 seconds before my left knee began to shake. The second lasted 22. By the third, sweat had collected at the base of my neck. "Enough," Lena said. Again. "No." That's usually my line. That's why I enjoy saying it. For a moment, I considered pushing. Then stopped. "You're right." She blinked. "I should document this day. Don't you dare create another version." The joke escaped before I could stop it. Lena had no idea why it made me laugh harder than it deserved to. The next morning, the fire investigator sat across from me in a small interview room with a legal pad and an audio recorder placed visibly on the table. He confirmed I was comfortable with the conversation being recorded. I said yes. Then he walked me through the night again. Where had I been sitting? Where had Dad been? Where was Mom when she turned back? Which door did they use? What words did I hear? "Leave her," I repeated. My throat tightened even after all these days. "What else?" Mom said, "Let her die in there. If Natalie's gone, Sabrina gets everything." He did not react beyond writing it down. "How certain are you of the wording?" "Very." Could she have said something similar? "She said those words." He nodded. "How did you get out?" I stood. His eyes came up. "From the wheelchair?" "Yes." "You told the first investigator you normally use the chair full-time." "I do." "Can you walk?" "Not independently. I have an incomplete spinal cord injury. For months I've been practicing supported standing and a few steps with braces and something to hold." "How far did you go that night?" "Farther than I should have." He almost smiled. Almost. Then he turned a page. "Was there any conversation before the fire that struck you as unusual afterward?" My father said, "After tonight, Sabrina won't have to wait anymore." "Wait for what?" At the time, I thought control of the company. And now? I don't know what he meant. That answer seemed to matter. Not because it helped Dad. Because it was true. The investigator asked about the succession document. I explained when I discovered it and where it had come from. Then he asked whether I had anything showing current pressure around ownership or management. The settlement came to mind. I had not brought it to make the fire look worse. But it was relevant to context. "There is something." I explained that Dad had offered me the CEO position if I agreed to close the company review, stop examining old governance questions, and coordinate public language around the fire. "Do you have the document?" "Yes." "Would you provide a copy?" "Yes." Not because I expected that agreement to prove he had caused the fire. It didn't. It proved he wanted questions to stop. That was all I said. Before leaving, I also gave him the succession contingency and Denise's email chain with a short written explanation of how each had reached me. No conclusions. No accusations beyond what the documents showed. "This is what I have," I told him. "This is when I received it. If any of it matters to your investigation, you can decide that." For once, handing something over did not feel like surrendering control. It felt like placing the right evidence in the right room. Mom called less than 2 hours later. I answered because I wanted to know why. Her voice came fast. "Why are you making it sound like we left you?" My hand tightened around the phone. "I'm not making it sound like anything. Your father had to answer questions for almost 2 hours. That was information I had not known until she told me. I said nothing. They're treating us like criminals. I told them what happened. You told them your version. I told them what I saw and what I heard. You know your father would never. I'm not discussing his intentions with you. Mom inhaled sharply. Natalie, I'm done cleaning up wording because the facts make you uncomfortable. Then I ended the call. At 6:14 that evening, a new board packet arrived. The subject line read, Clarified Historical Minutes and Delegated Authority Record. I opened it at my condo. The first pages looked ordinary. Old approvals, board resolutions, delegation notes. Then, I reached a set of minutes from the previous year. One paragraph made my shoulders go rigid. The paragraph stated that Sabrina had been granted broad discretion over brand development expenditures and that her authority had been previously acknowledged without objection by President Natalie Carter. I remembered those minutes. Not vaguely. I had prepared part of the operational appendix for that meeting. The sentence had not been there. My email archive contained the packet sent to me 3 days after the meeting. I opened it. Read the section. No paragraph. Version label in the footer. Different. My pulse quickened. A call went to Maya. Are you home? Yes. Do not access anything outside your normal permissions. A pause. That's a very specific greeting. I just received clarified minutes from Dad's office. So did I. There's language in them I've never seen. What language? I read it. Maya went quiet. Then she said, I can check the document history tomorrow morning under retention review. Normal access only. Yes, Natalie. Send nothing to me that I'm restricted from. I heard you the first 4 times. Make it 5. The next morning, she came into my office carrying no folder. That told me she had learned something. The system log shows the file was edited after the fire. A tingling sensation moved through my hands. When? She gave me the timestamp. Days after I had formally questioned the spending. Days after the investigator had begun asking for more detail. Can you tell who typed the paragraph? No. Can you tell where the edit went through? Executive administration chain. Good. She frowned. Good? Because that's what it proves. I pulled up my old packet. This proves the version I received then did not contain the paragraph. Maya tapped the screen. And the audit trail proves the stored final was changed recently. Nothing more. Right. Then the second problem registered. Dad's new paragraph claimed Sabrina had broad delegated authority. The actual approval matrix said she did not. He had tried to create a document that protected the spending. Instead, he had created a contradiction. I sat back. What? Maya asked. He gave us both sides. She followed my gaze toward the matrix, then understood. The board review began that afternoon. Dad sat at the head of the table. Mom was beside him. Sabrina occupied the chair across from me. Ellen and Thomas attended in person this time. Maya sat near the far end, with the document system open. Outside counsel and an independent accounting advisor were there to answer process questions, not to tell the story. That part belonged to me. Dad opened first. This has become unnecessarily adversarial. Ellen stopped him. We're here to review the transactions and the record issue. He leaned back. I opened my folder. Then I'll start with what we know. No childhood stories. No fire photographs. No accusation that Dad had tried to kill me 6 years ago. Just the spending. Several transactions fell within Sabrina's authority. Those are hers, I said. Sabrina stared at me. I continued. Several others lack adequate deliverables or disclosure. Those need review before anyone labels them improper. Thomas nodded. And the larger commitments? I slid the approval matrix forward, above her threshold. Dad spoke. Her authority had been expanded. Show me the board resolution. He pointed toward the clarified minutes. It's documented. I turned to Maya. Can you explain only the document history? She did. No opinions. No accusation. Just the dates. The version currently identified as final had been edited after the fire. Then I handed Ellen and Thomas the board packet that had been emailed to me after the original meeting. This is the copy I received at the time. Thomas compared the pages. The paragraph isn't here. No. Dad's voice hardened. Minutes are clarified all the time. Yes, I said. But clarification does not retroactively create authority that contradicts the approved matrix. That was the first moment his face changed. Only slightly. I moved to the old incident record. The same problem appears 6 years earlier. The insurance copy I received after my accident refers to an unresolved safety issue. The archive version does not. Denise Harper has confirmed she wrote an earlier version, referencing a recommended delay. Dad cut in. Denise took severance and left angry, which is why I'm not asking anyone to rely on her character. I placed the email chain on the table. I'm asking you to rely on the email. Thomas read Dad's old reply. Natalie is already on her way. We are not delaying this again. Nobody spoke for several seconds. This does not prove every motive I fear, I said. It proves that records changed when they threatened the story being presented afterward. Mom finally spoke. You're accusing your own father of trying to kill you. No. Her mouth closed. I'm saying the succession contingency existed before my accident. He knew the inspection had been recommended for delay. The report changed afterward. Sabrina benefited from my incapacity. Those are documented facts. Then I put the settlement on the table. And this week, I was offered the CEO position if I agreed to close the current review, stop examining historical governance decisions, and coordinate public language around the fire. Sabrina looked at Dad. I did not know what she was thinking. I only saw her read the first page twice. Dad leaned forward. I was trying to save this company from becoming collateral damage in Natalie's obsession. There it was. The word he needed. Obsession. Something irrational. Something female. Something personal. I almost smiled. Then why did the minutes change after I raised the issue? His jaw tightened. They were corrected. To grant Sabrina authority she never had. She operated under my authority. The room went still. I looked at him. Then we agree. His eyes narrowed. On what? That she did not act alone. Sabrina's head snapped toward him. Dad immediately shifted. My point is that Sabrina made reckless decisions. She exceeded what I intended. If some documentation was imprecise, that does not make me responsible for every invoice she signed. He slid another packet toward Ellen. A summary of Sabrina's approvals. Vendor decisions. Brand expenses. Her name appeared again and again. It would have been easy to let him do it. Easy to let my sister become the entire problem. She had accepted the title. Spent the money. Mocked my wheelchair. Asked how long everyone was supposed to wait for me. Part of me wanted to sit back and watch the golden child finally discover what happened when the light moved away from her. Instead, I opened the approval matrix. Sabrina is responsible for what she approved and what she benefited from. She looked at me. I kept going. But she could not authorize these. My finger moved down the page. These commitments required executive override. Another line. These required a second approval at chairman level or equivalent authority. Another. And these could not have cleared under her delegation as it existed on the transaction date. Thomas looked toward Dad. Robert? Dad said nothing. The answer was no longer in his voice. It was in the system he had tried to rewrite. The independent directors asked the rest of us to wait outside while they spoke with counsel. 23 minutes passed. Sabrina stood at the far end of the hallway, arms folded so tightly against herself they looked locked. Mom stayed beside Dad. Nobody spoke to me. For once, I did not feel responsible for filling the space. When we were called back, Ellen read the decision. Dad's management authority would be suspended pending an independent review. Sabrina's financial authority would also be suspended. Control of relevant records would move under the review process. Normal payroll, vendor commitments, production, and customer operations would continue. Then Ellen looked at me. Natalie, we're asking you to maintain interim operational authority under board oversight until the review is complete. Not ownership, not a gift, not immunity, responsibility with limits. The kind of authority Dad had spent years pretending was weakness. I nodded. I'll do it on one condition. Dad stared at me. Ellen asked, what condition? No blanket shutdowns. No punishing employees for executive misconduct. Vendors get paid for legitimate work. Payroll runs. Customer commitments continue unless the review identifies a direct problem. Thomas nodded. That's reasonable. Ellen agreed. Dad pushed back from the table. You think you've won? The question almost made me laugh. For years, winning would have meant hearing him say I was better than Sabrina. Taking his chair, making him regret underestimating me. Now the chair looked smaller than it had in my imagination. No, I said. I think the company finally stopped belonging to whatever story you tell about it. He left without answering. Later, after everyone else had gone, Ellen remained behind. The review may confirm what you've shown us. Or it may not confirm all of it. That's true. She studied me for a moment. If it does, are you prepared to take the CEO role permanently? My father's office was visible through the glass wall behind her. The chair was still there. Same leather. Same high back. Same place I had once imagined as proof that I had finally become enough. Less than a week earlier, Dad had offered it to me as the price of silence. Now someone was asking whether I would take it if the process itself proved I had earned the authority. I looked at the chair, then at Ellen. Not on his terms. The review took 26 days. Long enough for everyone at Carter Millworks to stop whispering every time I rolled past. Long enough for customers to start asking whether leadership changes would affect their contracts. Long enough for 3 vendors to call me directly and say, in different words, please tell me somebody is still running the place. Someone was. That someone just wasn't willing to destroy herself proving it anymore. The first Monday after Dad's authority was suspended, I arrived at 8:20 instead of 7. Nobody died. Production still started. Payroll still cleared. The world did not punish me for sleeping an extra hour. That realization should not have felt revolutionary. It did. Maya was waiting in my office with a folder. The independent team finished the transaction review. Today, final report came in 20 minutes ago. She placed the folder on my desk without opening it for me. That small gesture mattered. People had spent 6 years assuming that because I sometimes needed help reaching a shelf, lifting a box, or crossing a large building, I also needed help making decisions. Maya had never made that mistake. I opened the report. The first pages were exactly what I had expected. Procedures. Scope. Limitations. Then came the findings. Westbridge Creative Advisory had received payments for services that could not be fully supported by the deliverables on file. Several client development expenses had been charged to the company without adequate disclosure of Sabrina's personal relationships with the vendors involved. Some expenses were badly governed rather than clearly improper. Others required reimbursement. The report made that distinction carefully. So had I. I kept reading. Several higher value commitments had exceeded Sabrina's delegated authority at the time they were made. Those payments had required executive overrides. Dad's approvals appeared repeatedly. Not every time. Enough. A second section addressed board records. The paragraph, claiming that Sabrina's expanded authority had been previously acknowledged by me, had been inserted after the original meeting. The change had not gone through the normal board amendment process. The report did not use words like sinister or conspiracy. It used the kind of language that frightened executives more. Unsupported. Inconsistent. Improperly modified. Control failure. Governance breach. My eyes moved farther down. The old incident files related to my accident were outside the accountant's authority to determine motive or criminal responsibility. But the report confirmed discrepancies between versions and recommended that the record integrity issue be forwarded to appropriate outside reviewers. No miracle sentence. No line saying Robert Carter tried to kill his daughter. That sentence did not belong there. What the report did say was enough. Maya sat across from me. You okay? I turned another page. Yes. You've been reading the same paragraph for a while. I spent 6 years wishing somebody would write down that I wasn't imagining it. And now? Now I wish the truth had been less expensive. She nodded. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then I closed the folder. Payroll? Clear. Production? West Plant is 1 day behind on the hospital millwork package. Material? Arrived late Friday. Move the finishing crew Tuesday. Don't add overtime unless scheduling confirms it saves the delivery date. Maya smiled. What? Nothing. No, say it. The company could be collapsing around you, and you'd still ask about finishing schedules. It's not collapsing. That was the point. Dad had spent years making everyone believe that exposing him would destroy the business. The review had exposed him. The machines were still running. The next board meeting lasted less than 2 hours. Dad attended because he was still a shareholder, and because the board had not removed every legal right he possessed, simply because everyone was angry with him. That distinction mattered too. Consequences were stronger when they did not require pretending rules disappeared for people we disliked. He sat at the far end of the table instead of the head. I noticed. So did he. Ellen opened the meeting. The review confirms significant governance failures, improper modification of board records, and transactions requiring corrective action. Dad interrupted. We've already discussed the deficiencies. Ellen looked at him. We are discussing the consequences now. He leaned back. I almost admired how quickly he could rearrange himself around lost power. Almost. Sabrina sat beside Mom. She had not been allowed to approve $1 in nearly 4 weeks. Her title remained on paper until that meeting. Not after it. Ellen continued. Dad would no longer serve as executive chairman or hold any management authority. His signing authority was removed. He would retain whatever shareholder rights the corporate documents legally gave him, but no special access to operational systems, no control over board agendas, and no right to direct employees. Sabrina's executive role was terminated. The company would seek repayment or other remedies for expenses identified by the review as improperly supported or personally beneficial. Further determinations would depend on counsel, insurers, and any agencies with jurisdiction. Mom's board seat was different. She had not signed the spending. She had not altered the company records herself, at least not according to anything the review established. But the board voted to remove her from committees related to governance and internal controls, and she resigned the seat before the meeting ended. Her voice was tight when she said, "Apparently my own daughter has made it impossible for me to contribute." I looked at her. No. The board made a governance decision. You know exactly what I mean. I do. That was why I refused to accept the wording. Dad finally turned toward me. You've embarrassed everyone in this room. Thomas Greer closed his folder. Robert, the report is not Natalie's opinion. Dad ignored him. His attention stayed on me. You could have handled this privately. We tried private. Mom flinched. Maybe she remembered the fire. Maybe she remembered the settlement. I did not know. I only knew what I saw. Dad's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. You've damaged the name your grandfather built. No. I said. I stopped using his name to hide what happened under it. That was the last time I argued with him about the review. Afterward, I had somewhere more important to be. The fire investigator had asked for an updated meeting once the company review was complete. This time, I called him first. The documents went into a slim file box. Not everything. Only what might reasonably matter. The succession contingency prepared before my accident. Denise's email chain. The incident report versions I had legally received. The settlement Dad offered after the fire. The board findings related to altered records and executive approvals. A timeline showing when the spending review began, when the succession expansion appeared, and when the fire happened. No highlighted arrows. No dramatic labels. No page titled, "Proof my parents tried to kill me." At the station, the investigator brought in another detective I had met once before. They asked where each document came from. So I told them. This was emailed to me before a board meeting. This came from my insurance claim. Denise gave me this chain and confirmed where she retained it. This settlement came directly from my father. The detective tapped the succession contingency. You believe this connects to the old accident. I believe it may explain why the timing matters. That's not what I asked. No, you asked what I believe. He waited. I looked at the document. My parents benefited from me becoming incapacitated 6 years ago. My father knew there was a recommendation to delay that inspection. The succession plan was already prepared. The incident record changed afterward. And the fire? My mother said Sabrina would get everything if I died. My father closed the door. A new authority expansion was already being circulated while I was in the hospital. Do you believe they intended for you to die? The room went very still. There had been a time when I would have needed him to say the answer for me. Not anymore. I believe they were willing to leave me there, knowing I might. He wrote something down. Then I pushed the file box toward him. This is what I have. This is when I received it. This is why I think it may matter. You decide what it proves. Walking out of that building felt different from walking in. Not because the case was finished. It wasn't. Not because someone had promised me prison sentences. Nobody had. It felt different because the truth was no longer something I had to carry alone, simply to keep everyone else comfortable. A week later, Ellen and Thomas asked me to stay after a board meeting. Maya gathered her papers. Ellen stopped her. You can stay if Natalie wants. I looked at Maya. Stay. Ellen slid a document toward me. CEO appointment. No settlement attached. No release. No clause about historical disputes. No promise to coordinate public language. The governance structure was different too. Independent compliance review. Clear reporting lines. Annual control testing. Formal authority limits applying to every executive, including anyone named Carter. Thomas said. We'd like you to take the role permanently. I read the first page twice. Not because I was surprised. Because I wanted to know whether the chair was still a trap. What happens when another family member wants an exception? Thomas leaned back. They don't get one. And succession? Performance and board approval. No automatic family placement? No. External controls review annually? Ellen nodded. And I want the authority matrix approved at board level, not changed by whoever sits in this office. That's already in the proposal. Maya tried not to smile. I caught her anyway. Ellen looked at me. You have more conditions? Yes. Neither director seemed bothered. For the first time in my career, conditions coming from me were not treated like attitude. Emergency work, I said, means actual operational risk, not an executive refusing to plan. Nobody gets praised for rescuing preventable chaos at midnight. Thomas gave me a curious look. That sounds personal. It became expensive enough to become corporate. He laughed once. Fair. The document stayed on the table for another minute. The title was the same one Dad had offered me. CEO. But the first version had said, you can have power if you protect me. This one said, you can have authority if you accept accountability too. Same chair. Different price. I signed. That night, I did not stay late to celebrate. At 6:15, my laptop shut. Maya appeared in the doorway. CEO? Leaving before sunset? Document it for future generations. You want dinner? Not tonight. You have plans? Yes. Her eyebrows rose. That answer still surprised people, including me. My plan was not glamorous. I went home. The condo had spent the last month slowly becoming mine. The box of company files disappeared from the living room. The spare room became exactly that instead of a records bunker. I had contractors adjust a section of the kitchen counter so I could use it comfortably from my chair and while standing for short periods. Mom would have called one of the changes unnecessary. That was partly why I liked it. A bookcase went where she had once insisted I needed more medical storage. The dining table stayed clear. Saturday became a no-company email day unless payroll, safety, or an actual production emergency existed. The first Saturday I tried it, my hand reached for the laptop 4 times before noon. By the 4th, I laughed at myself. Lena had me stand at my own kitchen counter the following week. Not at the clinic. At home, 29 seconds. Sit. Rest. 34. Sit. No applause. No one filming. No father waiting to see whether I had become useful enough again. Just me, my brace, my hands against the counter, and the smell of coffee. That was better. Sabrina asked to see me near the end of the month. She did not come to the CEO office. I suggested a coffee shop. Neutral ground. She arrived 5 minutes late and looked around as if she expected someone to recognize her. Nobody did. For once, neither of us had an audience. I'm paying back what they say I owe, she said. What the review established. Yes. Her tone made established sound insulting. I took a sip of coffee. What do you want from me? She looked hurt by the question. Maybe it was too direct. It was still necessary. Mom barely speaks to me. I can't fix that. Dad says I ruined everything. You didn't ruin everything. Her shoulders loosened. Then I finished the sentence. You're responsible for what you did. So is he. The relief vanished. Do you have to talk like a report? Probably. She looked down. Could you tell the board I didn't mean to steal from the company? I never told them you stole every dollar. You know what I mean. I know you want me to make the consequences smaller. That's not fair. Neither is asking me to clean up something I warned you about. Her hand closed around the paper cup. Dad told me those expenses were fine. Some were. And the rest? You signed them. She looked out the window. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Sabrina said, he was going to let me take all of it. What? The company. After your accident, my grip tightened slightly around my cup. She looked back at me. I knew there was a plan. I didn't know about the safety email. I swear. I did not tell her I believed her. I did not tell her I didn't. What did you know? That if you couldn't come back, I'd move up. You already told me that. I thought it meant if you couldn't work. And when I came back? Her face tightened. You made everyone see I couldn't do what you did. There it was. Not an apology. Something more useful. A truth she hated. I didn't make them see anything. You came back and fixed everything. That was my job. You always make it sound so simple. No, I make it sound like work. Sabrina sat with that. Then her voice softened. Can you at least help me explain this to Mom? Old muscle memory. Natalie fixes. Natalie translates. Natalie absorbs. I set the cup down. I won't make this worse for you. She looked up. I also won't make it disappear. Her mouth parted. That was the boundary. Not punishment. Not forgiveness. A line. If we ever have a relationship outside Carter Millworks, I said, it can't be built around me rescuing you. She blinked several times, then nodded once. It was not reconciliation. It was not enough to undo anything. It was simply the first conversation we had ever had where I refused the role assigned to me. Months passed before the outside investigation moved far enough for me to receive anything concrete. When the call came, I was in my office reviewing a production forecast. The detective told me the investigation involving the fire and the historical materials had progressed beyond the initial fact-gathering stage. Certain matters had been referred for further legal action. He did not promise an outcome. He did not tell me everything. That was fine. By then, I no longer needed punishment to happen at the speed of my anger. Dad had already lost management control. Sabrina had lost executive authority. Mom no longer controlled a board seat. The company had recovered money and tightened its controls. Whatever the justice system decided would come from its own evidence and standards. My life had already moved. The final handover meeting with Dad lasted 23 minutes. He had requested access to old personal office items and several shareholder documents. Everything legitimate had been prepared. Nothing more. Mom came with him. Neither entered my office. We met in the conference room. Dad signed the receipt. I signed the handover record. That should have been it. As I turned toward the door, his voice stopped me. You're really going to walk away from your own family? 6 years earlier, those words would have pinned me to the floor harder than my damaged legs ever could. Mom stood beside him. Her face looked smaller somehow. Older. I did not know whether she regretted what she had done. I did not ask. Regret without accountability had cost me enough. My wheelchair was angled toward the hallway. The cane was clipped along the side. Slowly, I set the brakes. Dad watched. So did Mom. My right hand wrapped around the cane. The left pressed against the armrest. Standing still required concentration. It probably always would. My knees trembled as my weight shifted forward. The brace held. So did I. 1 second. 2. Then upright. Mom inhaled sharply. You can. Some. That was all she got. No miracle speech. No triumphant reveal. The wheelchair had never made me weak. Standing did not make me worthy. The hallway to the elevator was farther than I could safely walk without resting, so I did not try to prove anything stupid. 3 careful steps. Pause. Another 2. Enough to reach the chair Maya had placed near the wall weeks earlier for my short-distance practice between offices. I sat, rested, then stood again. Dad remained behind me. You think this proves something? His voice had followed me my entire life. Good daughters stay. Responsible daughters fix things. Strong daughters do not complain. Disabled daughters should be grateful anyone still needs them. I looked back once. 6 years ago, you took my legs and expected the rest of me to follow. Mom's lips parted. In that fire, you learned I could still stand. Dad's face hardened. I tightened my hand around the cane. What neither of you ever understood was that walking away had nothing to do with how far my feet could carry me. Then I turned toward the elevator. The rest of the distance I covered in my wheelchair. That mattered. I had no interest in pretending freedom required me to become the woman I had been before the accident. The elevator doors opened. I rolled inside. For one last second, I could see Dad and Mom at the far end of the hall. Neither moved toward me. Neither called my name. The doors began to close. Years earlier, I would have waited for one of them to say something that changed everything. I'm sorry. We were wrong. You mattered. No words came. This time, I didn't need them. The doors closed. And for the first time in my life, leaving them behind did not feel like losing my family. It felt like getting myself back.